Let's start this session. To the panelists, the discussants, and to all participants, a warm welcome from me and Anke. I'll briefly introduce the panelists, the discussants soon, but I just want to repeat what Anke said for you who maybe didn't hear it. We said it a few seconds ago. Questions are super welcome, and you can start writing whenever from now on. So we'll have a question and answer session at the end. And please write in the question and answer facility that you have below on the bar. This session is also being recorded, so you know. Laura, Frida, and Soenke has agreed to be recorded, and we have, of course, and the audience will not be visible. We will not also not repeat your names when we post the questions, so you don't have to worry about that, but you should know about it. And so, welcome Soenke, who is working at the Global Engagement Department at Greenpeace International. And welcome Laura Hartman, who is the leader of the Sustainability Unit at Uppsala Municipality. And also to Frida Franzén, who is a Sustainability Analyst at Tyréns. A warm welcome to all of you.
Excellent, yeah. And the topic for the session is, do we have to change how we communicate about sustainability? Now, that is a bit of an awkward question, right? But so I'll explain a bit how we got to this question, why we think this is really important, why it's worth discussing this, and really giving this thought. So we all, I think, are aware, and the awareness generally is growing, that if we want to transform our society into a less unsustainable one, communication is key, right? You hear that everywhere, again and again. It almost sounds trivial, right? Because communication is so much, but it is an insight that many of us are hearing more and more, also from people who are traditionally not engaged with communication issues. And I'm personally reminded of that every year in September when we start our master's course in master's program in environmental communication and management, and the students coming from all walks of life coming to us saying, "But we think communication is so important, environmental communication is so important. I want to learn more about this." But at the same time, I guess many of us are also frustrated that so little change is really happening, right? It takes such a long time, so much time is passing. I guess the COP26 is another example of this, where many of us feel, yes, there is progress, but it's so slow. Why are things not changing faster if we know we have to become much more sustainable as a society overall? So if environmental communication was as powerful as we hope it to be and expect it to be, we would really expect to see more profound changes in society, you'd think. Maybe naive, but that you could think that, right? And why? Well, the reasons why we don't see these changes, there are many of them, but one of the reasons might be really that we might have to take a step back and rethink how we do communication. We rethink our approach to environmental communication, how we do it in practice. And that's really the starting point of our Mistra environmental communication program. So taking a step back, reflecting on what do we mean when we say communication, what are our expectations, how do we do it then? And what needs to change if we think it doesn't work the way how it's happening today. And we've got the three of you here today. You're all working with environmental and sustainability communication in very different ways and in different contexts, so that's going to be interesting. And I assume that in your work, you also have certain expectations in what environmental communication that your organization engages in, what that should do, what that should affect. And that it probably holds whether we talk about campaigns or events such as the Uppsala Sustainability Week or consultancy work or dialogue processes or whatever. So we want to hear from you now in the next hour and a bit about your experiences there and where you see the need for communication practice to change. And I would suggest we start with a little round here and hear from you how you do environment communication in your organization and what your expectations are in these contexts. So just a brief statement to get our audience also into the right frame. So who are you? How are you working with communication? What do you hope communication achieves in the context that you're active in? And Laura, do you want to start?
I can start. Thank you. I must start by saying that I totally, of course, agree in what you're saying. Communication is the key. That's the main tool if you want to make a change, if you want to make an impact, if you want to reach out with all the knowledge you're producing, you have to communicate, and you have to see it as a dialogue. But communication is more than that. In Swedish, there's a saying, fuzzy said means fuzzy thought. So often my experience is that when you start really putting words to and think of explaining something to somebody else who's not that into the issue, you quite quickly realize that, well, my argumentation might not hold. I have to think more about this. I have to work more on this, and that's basically my expectation when it comes to that in my organization as well. I think communication must be sort of borne by everybody, and that's our goal in Uppsala municipality as well. Everybody should be involved. It's not only the communicators. Everybody should be able to explain what we're doing. It comes definitely to sustainability communication as well. Sustainability should be the sort of the starting point to everything we do, and we must be able to explain it. And I think we've come a bit on that road. At least everybody knows that the goal of Uppsala municipality is fossil-free 2030. That's a phrase. We have some of those phrases that really have gotten stuck in the organization. We try to emphasize people and concrete example in order to really make a change. I mean, you impact by getting onto people's feelings, not only with ratio. So people and concrete examples are what we use. And then I think it should be, we shouldn't forget about the internal communication as well. That's a way of including everybody. If we want that everybody takes responsibility for communication, you really have to reach out internally. We are 18,000 employees in the municipality, so that's a task as well. I stop there.
Excellent. Soenke, very different context.
Well, actually, quite similar to hardly what Laura said, so I do fully agree with that. Generally, I mean, the organization as such has a long history, and was actually also co-founded by journalists. So it comes naturally that we communicate about environmental issues. That's at the core, and it's kind of a given. But the media landscapes have become far more complex, and working, in an international office, which has for a long time actually also coordinated and actually managed even international campaigns, has actually moved to being more of a general coordinator to support the national and regional offices we have, which are all autonomous, and not just in their funding, but also in the way they work. So we're trying to avoid that cacophony of voices, and that we have general agreement on our communications. We have different communication hubs which support regionally these efforts. So that's kind of how we work in practice, or in theory. In practice, it is far more complex sometimes, and there's a lot of hiccups, of course. But what I have seen is that we have shifted very much also in two ways. One is in the area of the digital, So the digital communications have become far more important than the traditional work that you would connect with communications, which is contacting the media to actually then disseminate messages. It still works, obviously, for large events, like the COP that we just saw, and could definitely also see that our organization was quite present there, also through our international executive director, Jennifer Morgan. And but actually, what actually makes people act, and that is actually the main goal of any campaign, is to get people to act, either go out on the street and protest, or actually to change potentially even the way they do their daily tasks, so influence their lifestyle, which is more connected actually to sustainability issues. Although we do ask our governments, of course, to follow these as well. But we'll come back to that. So I'll stop here.
And just a clarification question: the latter, that you're sort of trying to get to individuals to either go out and protest or change their lifestyles, their habits, you do that through that's going back to the more digital channels of communication, or how do you do that?
Yeah, that's usually where in those communication instances where you have a direct way of communicating with the individual. This could be actually through social media, especially Facebook, I would say, but also on the street when we have colleagues there, or even doing actions on the street. I've seen some great examples, actually, especially from Asia, which using different techniques to get people thinking and acting.
Cool, excellent. Frida.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. I would first start with, this is my experience as an employed at Tyréns, so this is not from a strategic point of view or something. But also in this question, I'm thinking of doing communication is some kind of combination of how we communicate and what we communicate. So I'm not really sure on how to answer this question, but I think at Tyréns we have, of course, different ways of doing communication, from this big ordinary campaigns commercial for the company, where I think the goal is to show that we're a credible, responsible actor. And in these campaigns, I've seen a change the last 1 or 2 years. It's mainly that sustainability is more underlying or overarching in everything we do. And also that we're not planning and building cities, we're planning and building societies. So I think it's a part of a trend of communication, that we don't only talk about cities, we also talk about rural areas, and that the way towards sustainability will look differently in different type of societies. And the last one is also that Tyréns want to show that we make real changes in sustainability, not only talking. So that's the main, the overlying, the big campaigns. But then we of course have communication mainly in our projects. And here we also have implemented a new systematical program for all projects, which means that more consultants have to talk about communication, have to talk about environmental communication and communicate sustainability with customers. It's so early, but it would be interesting to see what that will lead to. And then of course we have our everyday work, so we work quite much with dialogues and consultation processes with publics or customers or concerned actors. And then we have, as I think Laura mentioned, the internal work with the vision and missions for Tyréns, which I think is very important to really make that clear, or clearer at least. So you see like some direction in your work. And then the last thing I want to mention is the individual or personal way. What you do is also communicating something. So what kind of choices you make as an individual is also part of your work, which I think is often, we don't think about this so often. And my expectation at Tyréns is more or less honesty, which is of course sometimes very complex and problematic. That okay, if is this sustainability, is it overarching in everything we do? So honesty, and also to bring in the listening, so that Tyréns is listening to its employees, and that we also listen to other actors in society. So the listening part of communication, I think, is important.
Excellent points. Yeah, you mentioned this with everything we do, we are communicating. Could you give an example for that?
With sustainability and everything?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that was, I mean, it's we build sustainable societies. That's part of the phrases in the commercial for Tyréns, which I think is new. Another one is hållbarhet utan floskler. So what's that?
Sustainability without phrases or something?
Yeah. It's that not only talking, not only talk, we do. So that's part of some campaigns.
Okay.
Great. Thanks all of you. Okay, so now you have talked about how you do communication, and to some extent also what you communicate. But where does then environmental communication in your organization, or Frida, as you said, in your experience, not meet your aspirations? Where does it not achieve what was intended? And it would be super good if you could connect this to a concrete example about honesty, that you said also, Frida, because of course it doesn't always work exactly as intended. Why do you think it is? What are the implications? And how could it or should it be addressed or changed? Should we start again with Laura, please?
You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, I think this is a bit tricky, probably in many organizations, but not least in a municipality context or in a politically steered public organization, where sort of the balance between impacting, trying to change people's behavior and going too close to their personal lives, and in worst case sort of making people feel guilty or making people feel that well is it up to us, you should be doing things as well as an organization. Those balances are quite difficult, and of course there's not always a political agreement on where the line goes. So this is a frequent issue that is being discussed among both politicians and of course civil servants in the municipality, and also the balance between sort of hope and despair. Is the situation really bad? Is it too bad? What does that do to people if they lose their hope, or if they sort of also lose their hope in that the politicians will be able to solve this? But on the other hand, if we too much communicate possibilities, how the bright future is there, if we just do something a bit more, it might be interpreted as a greenwashing. So all these sort of balances are there every day. So I guess I could definitely, I don't have actually a very good example in mind right now, but I'm sure that there are lots of examples where where people have reacted. I think you only should go to the Facebook sites of our politicians to read the comments from the common. I think one example where this is really truly an issue is when we build the new areas south of Uppsala, and all the debate to that project. Is that good? Is that bad? Why is it done in Uppsala? Is it better that it's done here, compare where we are aware of climate and environmental issues, rather than in some other place where the politicians and the municipality is not as aware of those. So whatever the municipality and whatever our politicians or civil servants answer to those comments, there's always somebody who is sort of reacting. And I think that is good, of course. The debate in a democracy should be lively. But of course, sometimes the way of communicating and campaigns and these kind of issues do not sort of go perfectly well, if I put it like that. Now I don't hear you.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. I was just going to ask you that, Laura. Is that a proof of really that communication is good, that you have a lively debate and that you have controversies that you can lift up, or is it due to something that you have done within the municipality's communication, do you think? And you partly already answered that.
I think debate is good. That's necessary. All these questions that we get, but of course, if the aim with some kind of communication measure that we do is to make a change, and everything we get is just lots of critique, of course, that's not maybe not perfectly well. I would also say that there are, of course, and I guess I said that already, there are lots of conflicts of interest and goals within different issues as well, which of course affects the sort of what do we want to communicate, and whom do we want to impact. So yeah, it's complicated, but we keep on communicating. And I think what we're discussing a lot right now is that we have to find this sort of the basic bottom line should be that there a positive tone where we try to show the quality of life, how changing your behavior towards more climate friendly and environmentally friendly is actually leading you to a good life, not sort of making your life poorer or duller or something in some sense worse. So for instance, emphasizing the health issues of different kind of behavior changes is something that we use more.
I think your point about your expectation being, well, we work towards change, and then all you get is lots of critique, and basically the change process stalls. That's super important. It also links back to the discussion we had earlier this morning on the value of conflict and how we deal with conflict and how we see conflict. Maybe that's something we should keep in mind for later on in the discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Great. Okay, Soenke, what are your experiences when communication doesn't really do what it was intended to do?
Well, as a German, I can always complain about these things. Comes naturally. And I work. I've always worked in Greenpeace in the area of analysis. So actually looking at the impact of our communications. And nowadays I work a lot actually identifying the communities and audiences we want to talk to. And actually, I started, often advising to campaigns to think about who and then what. So we do need kind of multiple streams of communication for different purposes, maybe even for the same campaign. And that is obviously a lot of extra work, but there's, we all know that one size doesn't fit all anymore. And things have become more complicated. Also, lifestyles have kind of become very different, and we might be able to talk about the same issue. Well, we can talk about the same issue to people in very different stratas of society. Be they, for example, conservatives versus maybe the more liberal and creatives, but also conservatives can of course be creative. So maybe a good example would be forest protection in Europe. Also something that we have seen also with Mistra, because we've been working with some organizations connected to that. For example, hunting is a highly polarizing issue. So, and in general, you'll come to other issues which are just as polarizing, climate change, etc. And that's something we've seen in the past years more and more. That means usually my advice is try to pick up people where they are, and then try to create a dialogue and create change that way. But it's of course very difficult to do that. And a lot of campaigns want to have a quick fix, pretty much.
Yes, yes.
They have a fixed timeline, and then they can't do this and that, and there's not enough budget for this and that. So it is a bit of a give and take, obviously. And then the other thing I always have to complain about a little bit is actually the sustainability of our campaigns. So often projects do not have a connect after they finish. So actually what we should be seeing, and if we're actually talking about behavior change and like environmental communications supporting that, then we have to have a long breath, pretty much. So you cannot expect people to change their lifestyle with just a bunch of communications that we put out within a 6-month period. It can take years till people actually adapt to that.
Yeah.
And communication has to adapt to that position. That's why the mention I made earlier between is your campaign actually focusing on behavioral change, which is often the case with sustainability, or are you trying to communicate with stakeholders who like politicians, companies, etc.? Then you might actually take a completely different communication approach or develop a different communication strategy, which is maybe more classic, by actually using news media to create pressure.
Soenke, I guess in Lauda's context, for example, I know in Lauda's context, as a municipality, you try to communicate via dialogue, and you create dialogues. So many actors come together, so you can reach that diversity that you talked about. Have you in any way tried getting a group together that are really diverse and having dialogues with them and see how they can learn from each other and communicate?
Yeah, some of our offices have definitely done that, especially the, I would say, younger offices. For example, we've only quite recently opened a regional office in the Arab region. And they've been quite experimental, and their general approach was, first of all, to actually kind of do unbranded things, and to start actually these dialogues in the frame of religion, of Islam. So using, opportunities like Ramadan to actually talk about sustainability and a greening of the Ramadan, and to consume maybe less, these kind of things. And that worked quite well, as it seems. So in a region where the organization is actually not really known.
Great, interesting, super interesting. Thanks, Soenke. Frida, what in your experience is sometimes going wrong or doesn't fulfill the intended communication ideal, or what was meant?
Yes, it's quite many attempts, I think. But my first reflection is that if we might have too high expectations on what environmental communication should achieve, because in communication, in its core, is that you can only control more or less one part of that, what comes out, since communication is at least two actors or two people. So that's the first thing I'm thinking of, and the second thing is that I think we need to communicate more of the goals. I mean, sustainability is quite vague in a way. So what is the future? What's the everyday implication of a sustainable future? What do we need to sacrifice? What do we win? And I think that's a quite good start, I think, in communication, because if we go in a communication process and we have extremely different pictures of what this goal is, what is it that we should achieve, I think it's quite, it could be quite problematic. And I have a example of an internal work at Tyréns. I don't know if it's a failure, but it's we had a new value words and missions and visions launched this year, and it was actually a movie for internal use, made for these visions and so on. And what the speaker said was not problematic. We knew that it was the value words and the vision and mission. It's like great, but in combination with the pictures, so the film, and talking about the world we dream of, and only showing more or less constructions, roads, so no people and no green areas. This was quite provocative, I think, for many of us working with sustainability. I mean, maybe that was the goal with the film, but I think it was more that now we're a team, this is our mission, and so on. So then we started to make a small group and try to address these problems that we experience with these kind of like combined forms of communication with both text or readings and films. It has to be more aligned, and we have to talk about what is the future we dream of. We have to be brave and take that. What do we have to actually sacrifice? What do we win? What's the benefit of that? So I think the goal, setting goals, common goals, at least as far as it works, is quite important for communication, and also in like smaller projects, for example, in workshops and so on, which we work quite much with, to have that as a starting point.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, no, I that was an excellent point, I thought, about that. So we use the word sustainability, right? But as if that was one defined goal. And I did that now myself when I introduced the session. But of course, it isn't at all. So it's a big word with many meanings, and that are definitely also contested. And your illustration of how the images in the film sort of said something that didn't align at all with the words that you had in mind, and how that might be different for different people. That's a beautiful illustration, I thought. I wanted to, though, pick up a ball that you threw at us a bit earlier, Frida, when you said listening in communication, right? So you also said, well, it's always at least two participants in communication, if not more. How, if we go back to this question, what needs to change in communication to improve it, measured against whatever yardstick, but against our own yardsticks in the first place? Do you guys think that we need to listen more, in not only in our private communication, but also in the way how our organizations do communication in quite institutionalized settings? Does there need to be more space for listening?
I can start. I think yes, more listening, if it is combined with some kind of action after that. I think that's the best way of killing all trust and high thoughts. If you open up for a dialogue and you listen, and then you say, well, now we've heard what you said, now we do as we thought we would do. And I think we've seen maybe that's in the way the public sector has opened up for dialogue with the citizens previously, which doesn't, I mean, the world changes and expectations increase. I think you should see this kind of things in a continuum. It was better when we started to have some kind of inhabitants dialogues or citizen dialogues, of course, compared to nothing. And it might have worked to begin with, but expectations increase, and now I think we should find, and I know Mistra is working exactly on that issue, ways of really having dialogue and inviting earlier in the process, so you really can do and make an impact. So that only that we today think that the old ways don't function anywhere, we have any more, we have to find new ways, doesn't have to mean that, well, the old ways were wrong when we started doing them, because world changes and we should be able to adjust as well. Nobody was screaming after social media communication for 20 years ago. We didn't have any social media, but today I think many of us think that old media, traditional media, is not the way of reaching out. That is at least our experience in the municipality, that we don't these kind of press releases when we talk about we have a new contract, or we have a new goal, or we have a new prize that we won, is not the way of sort of getting attention. We have to use the social media, we have to impact through people and direct our communication towards these people. And we have some good examples of that. For instance, when we have been working in Gottsunda and really reaching out to people there with sustainability communication and getting all these rings around in the water. So I think more of that.
Mm-hmm. Any other views on listening? Whether we need to do more listening? And your point, Laura, was yes, listening, but then only if we can also follow up on it and not just take people's time and then just drop it, because we're raising expectations, right? And then we're actually disappointing people if we don't follow up on what they said.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's important really then also take action on what you've learned, pretty much. I mean, in campaigning, media monitoring and analysis has always been quite important, not just to actually see how one's own output actually performed, but also even before that, and that's what you sometimes nowadays it's called social listening, or when you're actually looking at what type of topics and issues are being talked about on social media. But you can also look at specific news media and see how an issue was treated over a longer period of time, potentially, and see what type of connecting points you can actually find, and where to start actually your conversation or your communications that you want to disseminate. So it's actually, I think the listening part is a key part. And as you then go further, it's actually a dynamic process. You need to continue listening to hear if you're heard, and then actually create a form of dialogue in that sense, if it's possible at all. But I would say that even an organization has a dialogue through the media with other stakeholders, pretty much. So that's also a form of dialogue. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Frida,
yes.
you wanted to add something, right?
Yes, I can only add. I totally understand listening, that kind of active listening when it comes to public consultation and so on. But I also meant that listening to other people's opinions and possibilities and conditions in life of doing something, that's listening in itself is also rewarding and a learning process. And I think that's also some kind of responsibility for us who works with sustainability in a way, that the listening is a way of our education, and it's a way of assessing how we could improve our communication. So if we don't listen and to what's the reaction to our communication, we cannot assess it in some way. So it's a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah. Just before we continue, I want to remind all the participants that you're super welcome to post questions in the Q&A session. We have a few, but we welcome more.
Great. Yeah, I think that was a really useful clarification.
Yes,
Frida,
Frida.
thanks.
Yeah.
I want to now slightly change tack and ask you a few questions on very different things. So the first one is that, of course, in the last couple of weeks, well, you can't get away in a session on a Tuesday after the COP26 finished without being asked about that. But so we read and heard a lot about this, right? And we heard a lot about whether it was success or failure and so on. What I want now to hear from you, from your perspectives, is what you think about the latest COP in Glasgow from the perspective of environmental communication. So what comes to mind when you think about the communication aspects of the meeting from your very different perspectives? Frida, you want to start? Yes, cool.
Yes, I mean, my first impression is actually this binary mindset or binary communication. It's either success or failures. It's no other way, and maybe that's how you have to see it. But it's and maybe that's the best way of saying something about the outcomes. But it's in general, I'm not really fond of this really binary thinking of it's either that way or that way. It's yes or no, or success or failure. So, but that's no further analysis on that. But that's what was my first feeling or impression of the communication around the results of the meetings.
Super interesting observation. Yeah.
Yes.
Laura, you're muted again. You just unmuted.
I try to push it, but I don't manage. Well, two things comes to my mind. The first thing is in line with what Frida is saying, but sort of the either hope or despair, and the critique between those, that those one criticizing Greta and the company for being too negative, and the other way around. And I think what I would like to see is sort of a constructive discussion on how can we combine these forces, how can we sort of include these Gretas and others into the political decision making without making them perhaps politicians right now, but sort of the dialogue between these groups. And it's not black and white, as I agree totally to that. And the other thing that I've thought of is that I would have expected even more communication from actors, seeing this as an opportunity, since the environmental and climate issues are on topic now. Let's do a press release telling that we are working on this, we are working on that. So sort of the broader debate on these issues, where not everything is connected directly to the meeting, but just seeing the opportunity to reach out in questions that are on topic and are interesting right now. We've seen some of those examples, but maybe I've missed most of them. But I would have expected to see even more. I don't know if it's good or bad, but that's how it usually goes, that people sort of take the opportunity, or organizations take the opportunity.
Interesting. Yes. Soenke, do you have any spontaneous thoughts on that?
Well, I've kind of followed many of these COPs,
yes,
and every year it becomes more pressing, and especially in terms of acting, and we haven't seen a lot of that. And even at this one, I mean, when I would say company lobbyists outnumber, I would say, the civil society representatives by 12-1, with almost 30,000 people attending the COP, I find that very telling. So, and it is sad that it's always seen as binary, as Frida said, success or failure, but it's also that the success of one means the failure of another always. If you look at it in terms of countries, some countries, would interpret this as a massive failure because the problems they are currently having caused by climate change will definitely become worse in the coming years. And they're already at a point of no return, whilst other countries are still continuing the path of or following a paradigm of constant growth. And that probably even also connects or is probably even accelerated through the pandemic, where growth was kind of cut for a while and now needs to be pushed all the more. Like in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a bit of an environmental, I don't know, moment, I would say, but that has seemingly completely passed. And we've seen very little actually left from that. And now we see actually, even more non-sustainable growth in a lot of countries. I would say especially in the US, but also China and India have really been pushing for things not to go through in the end. And so that's my kind of first impression.
Okay, now we thought of another sort of quick thinking task where we've got concept pairs, right? And yes, they are a bit binary. That's part of the, hopefully, of the interest in doing this task. So I give you two concepts that are some sort of, they're complementary, maybe opposites. I ask you to say, well, which one do you align with more? Which one do you think is more important? Which one do you prefer? And I just want sort of relatively quick statements from you on this. So yes, I pretend they're binaries. They're not. We all know that. And you're allowed to discuss that as well. The first one is at the heart of organizational communication, I guess. Persuasion or dialogue? Soenke.
A tricky one. I do prefer dialogue, but probably persuasion is a part of that, of the dialogue. But generally, I would go for the dialogue side of it.
Why do you prefer that?
It has to do with what we heard before, talking about listening. So I think we have enough monologues actually, and they do not lead anywhere. If you really want to create change, you need a dialogue. You can be persuasive in your arguments, but I think that's the only way you can create change.
Laura, do you want to add to that?
I think the best thing is to manage to bake in your persuasion in the dialogue. You can keep on repeating your arguments. You can keep on talking about the same thing, but in a dialogue form. I think that's the best way of reaching out.
Cool, Frida.
I don't think I can add anything to that.
Good. Then you get the next one: conflict or consensus.
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. It's extremely difficult because like consensus, I think it's extremely hard to achieve. And conflict might be a good way of at least starting discussing things and getting everything up on the table. So I think I would rather choose that.
Good. Laura.
I think conflict often is the way of reaching to consensus. If you go immediately to consensus, I would get a bit worried. What have we missed? What have we not seen? So conflict, yes, and conflict can be done in very many different ways. a very negative or mean conflict does not has the best chances to reach to consensus all the time, but a constructive one. And then of course consensus is not always needed. I think in Sweden we are quite fond of consensus, but sometimes you just in a democracy you vote and you decide. And then of course if you want to get action, if you really want it to be implemented in our organizations, consensus or at least acceptance and understanding of why we're doing this is quite important. But it doesn't, I wouldn't say that it always has to be consensus. Sometimes you just have to accept and do things that majority has decided.
Soenke.
Yeah, I think the same for me, especially because I think very often what we end up with when we go for consensus is that nobody's happy, because it's so, especially when it comes to environmental issues, often we see something completely watered down with no effect at all for anyone, for any side. So sometimes it's actually better, as Laura just said, if you have no consensus and just have a decision. And just maybe one side will accept that for what it is. Maybe sometimes they're just better arguments on one side. And yeah, I think conflict can spur that. It shouldn't lead too far, otherwise you end up in polarization and then you can't move anything.
That's of course an important caveat as well. But that leads us neatly into another one of these pairs, voluntary measures or laws and regulations. Laura.
I immediately think that one thing is missing, and it's economic incentives.
Okay, yeah.
Carrots as well. And my experience is that is often quite I wouldn't be the economist that I am if I wasn't emphasizing the impact of economic incentives as well. So communication is important, and you need the combination of all three things in order to reach true change. And in the end, it's a cultural change that we want to, and change in norms and behavior we want to reach. So we definitely do need some kind of experience or feeling of voluntary change. But I think it's very often you need these regulations, laws, and economic incentives to make a true change as well. Without those, I'm not sure we're going to reach, or I'm quite sure that we're not going to reach the whole way to our goals.
Frida, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, it's more or less the same. I only think that laws and regulations are supposed to kind of facilitate a sustainable behavior, so you can make voluntary projects or choices in your life that is actually forming towards a sustainable future, which is not always the case, but of course it's important with laws and regulations. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
I think it's important to think that laws and regulations doesn't necessarily at all mean that we need more laws and more regulations. We need a lot of more innovation in order to reach our goals, and that means that sometimes we really do have to ease up those regulations in order to get some more innovation, for instance. But those are important tools to see over so that we know what we are doing. Sometimes we need harder restrictions, sometimes we need looser restrictions.
Or other maybe.
Or other restrictions, exactly.
I agree.
Soenke, any thoughts from you on this?
Well, I would also say that, yeah, we don't need more laws and regulations usually. I mean, that is usually, from my experience, it's always been only the last resort. So if nothing works. When it comes to industry, very often the voluntary measures have not really created any change. Actually, always tended to be a kind of business as usual if you actually go with that pathway. I do would agree on the idea that you need to create these opportunities actually, and they come actually through innovation, but also sometimes just doing. I mean, I always have to think about the example now currently being discussed, and I lived in the Netherlands for a long time in Amsterdam, where the municipality actually just built charging stations for electric vehicles all around the city, even in areas where people will not be able to afford an electric vehicle anytime soon. But it didn't matter for the municipality. They said we want a complete network, and you could, and only that enabled actually the usage actually, and created an incentive. And what you could see that in areas where maybe there were no private vehicles, you could suddenly see a lot of taxis actually charging at these stations, which had switched. Also because of the massive reduction of parking spaces. And so, yeah, it's the combination of things that are being done, maybe also on a voluntary level, that actually create these opportunities to act. And you need probably some laws and regulations to keep it within a certain frame.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad that your answers are more nuanced and detailed than my concept pairs there. So well done for that. Thanks a lot. Very interesting to hear from you, and thanks for going along with this.
Absolutely, thank you. We'll now start bringing in questions from the participants. And several of them have to do with when communication fails. Is it then the method or the content, the message or the story that needs to change? And in previous discussions, Soenke, you mentioned that, well, actually at the last year's environmental communication days, you mentioned that communication practices has had to change at Greenpeace International because traditional communication channels are becoming a bit obsolete, and you also touched upon that today. A question to all of you then, also building on the question from several questions from the audience. Have you had similar experience that certain methods and approaches to communication that have previously worked are not working anymore? Or was it more of what the content was in what you communicated? Who wants to start?
I'm very often the one starting, but maybe I'm so impatient. I think I was a bit into this already when I said that the world changes and you should change your communication methods and maybe content as well. So I think there are, I mean, one thing is of course the social media versus old media. Yeah, it was more effective 20 years ago to send a press release, but not today. We have to find other ways in social media. And then I think as well, what I was saying about the expectations that change in the dialogue and so on. So I think there are lots of changes in the environment that makes us to change our communication. I think it's most of the time the how we do it. I mean, of course, you can choose some kind of wrong phrase, putting your message in wrong words. But if you're doing communication in a professional way, you're not into reaching out with one sentence. You want to make a change of something. You want to reach out something that is more than just a sentence. Then in your how, you might choose the wrong way of communicating, where you put it into sentences in a press release or whatever, or on Facebook. But I would still say that it's not the problem with the message, it's the problem of how you chose your way of communicating. Yeah, I could continue talking. I get a lot of ideas of how, of course, well, I stop there. I leave space to the others. How instead of content, I think is the problem.
Yes, thanks, Laura. Soenke?
Yeah, I would probably agree. Like it is something that is in between as well. Again, I mean, usually we do know what kind of channels we should be using, etc., and the potential reach and whatever audiences they might actually engage. But it is always an experiment in the end. So we can never be 100% sure that it will actually work with the content that was developed, although it might have been tested with A/B testing and all kinds of methods we have nowadays, which actually enable us to even test messages. It's a bit going like communications is becoming a bit like advertising at times. So the whole industry, everybody's trying to secure their space in this huge landscape, and there's a lot of competition for that as well, even between NGOs, I would say. So you're trying to create your niche within that. But and I think the most important part actually, if something doesn't work, then you shouldn't worry. You should adapt. So try to learn from what is not working and why didn't it work, and not just think, oh, I failed, we'll go to the next project.
No.
Because it's important to understand why it didn't work. I think that is actually the key.
Frida, do you have any, thanks, Soenke, do you have anything to add, Frida, in that respect?
No, not really, with the channels and different channels and what's working and not working. Of course, social media is forcing everyone to make this really dense or condensed phrases that will actually throw people or make people interested to read more, and that's a little bit stressful, I think. But otherwise, I also think it's how we do it. So what we feel that the method we use for communication with, and in that terms, I come back to what we might have, or we're maybe passing this phase of shaming and so on, and coming towards what is this that we actually want to achieve, and see, like, I would really like to emphasize that we should see also humanity, the potential of humanity. Okay, we could do a lot of damage, but we're also a species that could do a lot of good, and to tell those stories and to actually act that way. We can make a parking lot, but we can also make an ecosystem of a parking lot. So it goes both ways, and when we see that potential, I think it's something is happening with us, and it gives this positive strength of acting, or I hope.
Thanks, Anke.
Yeah, excellent. I think that links to another comment that we have in the chat here, which says, in behavioral insights, we talk about communicating. No one is following restrictions, has the opposite effect. It doesn't motivate others to take action. Could it have the same effect on only communicating the failure around COP26, for example? So I think that alludes to the same thought, maybe. And that also goes beyond, I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Frida, as well. So maybe it's not only the method, it's also the message that we need to think more about, and maybe give positive examples that people can orientate themselves towards, rather than just telling the negative stories, which then creates a norm that things are negative, and then I don't need to bother anyway, right? Is that something you recognize as well? I think it does pick up things that you all of you maybe said earlier, but I just wanted to give some more space to that. If you think that is an important, relevant observation, or do you think it's unrealistic?
No, I think that, I mean, sustainability must be relevant to all people, and everyone must feel this urge, but also the willingness of doing something. And then we have to incorporate all different kind of stories. So and then we might need to communicate in different ways. I mean, I see, for example, this with the cities and rural areas. I think only the last year I've seen campaigns from different kind of organization is more focused on both. I mean, both cities and rural areas, and more towards, okay, you cannot do sustainability. You cannot take the bicycle or the bus to your job if you live here. So it's more emphasized that we try to include everyone, and I think that's a challenge. But we need to do that so everyone feels that this is relevant for me and I can do something, because of course everyone can do something and everyone must do something. But it's important to get that inclusive feeling in communication, which I think has been a failure in quite much environmental communication.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to say something around that?
Yeah, I really have to agree with Frida again. Also, this actually Greenpeace has in the past always been quite vocal about the negative effects of environmental destruction, etc. So that's what we're usually known for. Also using imagery and wording, which is yeah, quite confrontative and rather negative than positive. And I would say, yeah, in the last 10 years, we've actually decided on the strategy of if you have if you're criticizing something, you also have to show the solution to it. So you need the negative to be connected with something positive, and only the positive will incentivize, as was said, to actually act. If you go to the psychological motivators, or how psychology would explain that. So if you constantly shower people with negative messaging, of course they will not do anything. You cannot scare people into action. That obviously has never worked in the end. It might have in some cases potentially, but these are the exceptions. For example, Fukushima was certainly an exception, where I would say that fear was the main driver for change. But it was, of course, also quite a extreme event.
Yes, absolutely.
So.
Laura?
No, I don't have anything to add.
So then I have a question for all of you, building on what Soenke said from the one participant, that you mentioned, Soenke, that the goal of communication is action. And so what are your views on that? And do you have any concrete examples of where environmental communication leads to behavioral change? And is that, maybe I should add, is that the goal of communication? Soenke, maybe you want to start this time.
Yeah, I mean, there are different theories around this, also from media studies, that actually communication does add to the process of creating. Through the information, you're pretty much adding to the ability to act, because only if you have certain information will you be able to actually act. So that starts from the very simple part of being made aware, so the awareness building. But after that, people might go more in depth and continue seeking more information. And I think our goal is to provide that information when it's needed. And nowadays, we don't just have the push media, we also have the pull effect, which is much stronger, where you need to be able to actually also give people the information when they need it, when they are asking for it. And as an organization as Greenpeace, or as probably most organizations which are in that field of where they're actually providing also something in different forms, or being expected to provide something, that you actually ensure that you can. Otherwise, people will be, rather disappointed and don't feel that you're actually helping in the process.
I would say that not all communication aims at action. I mean, there's a very important point of, at least when it comes to public organizations, that you should be transparent. You should inform the citizens about the decisions, about the sort of the different things the organization does. Also to sort of making it possible for people to make good choices in the next election or whatever they are doing. So of course there's this transparency and information aspect to communication. But of course, there's an action perspective to that as well. And I think it would be, this is a very, very good question that I don't really know all the answers on, how you actually create behavioral change by communication. I think we need more studies, we need more experiments. I've done some of those and read lots of those in other areas, or maybe when it comes to social sustainability and things like that. But when you experimental studies where you send letters to people informing them of something, and you can then measure a change in their behavior afterwards. So it would be truly interesting to get more of those studies done in order to see if we get a short-term change, if we get a long-term change, if we get a large change in the whole population, how it spreads, the behavioral change, and so on. But I don't know the answers yet.
Frida, thank you, Laura. Frida?
Yes, I'm not sure if action is at least maybe the indirect, but maybe not the direct goal of environmental communication, because I think that the main aim might be to learn or educate, and the opposite, to listen and learn yourself. And then maybe that new picture that you have produced or created is a way of taking new decisions. And that might be acting in another way. So it's more indirect goal, I think.
We had also a few, we will not have time for another question, sadly, but we also had questions about measuring and monitoring communication that maybe we can bring with us into the further discussions we have during Miljökommunikationsdagarna. Okay.
Yeah, so I think we are already at the end of our session. We went through loads with lots of complexity,
yes,
and touched on so many different things. So I'm personally really glad we pressed the recording button. So we will also try to make the recording available if anybody later on wants to go through this once more.
Yeah.
There's also lots of interesting comments in the chat with which we in the panel maybe can have a look at now as well after the session. So thanks for that. Thanks first and foremost though to the three of you for your really insightful contributions. That was super interesting to hear from your very different perspectives. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.